Today we're looking at the comma. I'm going to do a series of videos about writing. We're going to do punctuation, capitalization, some other rules which perhaps you, like me sometimes, are not so familiar with. I must admit I'm more familiar with the grammar rules than punctuation rules, but punctuation is of course important. It can completely change the meaning of a sentence. There's a very famous example of a woman. Without her, man is nothing. Please look at that online. I'm not going to write it today. You'll find lots of websites which explain this, how the meaning changes if you punctuate the sentence differently. And there are millions of other examples, of course. But we're going to start with the comma, and we're going to look at all the different times when we use the comma, or the main times when we need a comma. So firstly, we need it for a list of nouns. I like eggs, beans and toast for breakfast. We need a comma after eggs and after beans. Now this one, some people don't use it. It's called the Oxford comma. It's a comma before and, also known as the serial comma. Now I think it's worth using because it does clear up unnecessary confusion. Look at the next sentence. I like ham and cheese and tomato sandwiches. Now, without any commas, it just means I like sandwiches with ham and cheese and tomato all together. But that's probably not what we want to say. We may mean I like ham and cheese sandwiches and tomato sandwiches, or we may mean I like ham sandwiches and cheese and tomato sandwiches. And so the comma is very important here where we put it. I think it's more common for us to write two things together and then the one thing on its own as a matter of style. So I think it's more common to say I like ham and cheese and tomato sandwiches, or I like cheese and tomato, comma, and ham sandwiches. They're probably the most common forms of this. But this is why the Oxford comma does clear up confusion, so it's worth using. I will always use it before and myself in a list. Now we can also use it in list of adjectives, but the adjectives must be interchangeable. Some adjectives are not interchangeable, and there's a very good way of checking if they are or if they aren't. So the second sentence here is an example of non-interchangeable adjectives, but the first is an example of interchangeable adjectives. Now the best way to check is either put an and in between the two adjectives and see if it sounds okay. So, I work in a comfortable and relaxed environment. That's fine, isn't it? Or you could also change places. You could say, I work in a relaxed, comfortable environment. The order of the adjectives doesn't matter here because they don't go together. But some adjectives do go together. You can't say, I bought a brand and new computer. You can't say, I bought a new brand computer, or unless you mean a new brand of computer, then it's okay. But when brand is an adjective meaning brand new, the two adjectives go together. They coordinate together. You can't separate them, and so you can't separate them with a comma either. So please remember, it's only interchangeable adjectives where you need the comma. It's not adjectives which are firmly set right next to each other. Okay. Ask me under the video if you want some more examples and I'll come up with some, but there are plenty online. Number 3, subordinate clauses. Now here are two different clauses. Having eaten lunch, I went home. They're two clauses which aren't really connected, and so, well, I mean they're connected by time, but you need a comma in between the two clauses. Then they sound much nicer with having eaten lunch, pause, I went home. I met him in London, pause, where I lived as a boy. Okay, and very often these subordinate clauses are joined by these words, and, but, nor, yet, so, and we still use the comma then. We don't generally use the comma after the, we use it before, by the way. The and comes after the comma. The comma comes before the and, or the yet, or the so, or the but, or the nor. Okay, relative clauses. I have another video on relative clauses, please. Click on the link to watch the video where you'll see me explain this grammar in detail, but there are defining relative clauses and there are non-defining relative clauses. Non-defining relative clauses involve extra information which is not essential, which doesn't define the first, the subject or the the first clause. So if we look at these two examples, my sister Susie is a paramedic. This is not correct for me, because if you put in the commas, that means that you only have one sister, and I have two sisters. But if you only have one sister, then you need commas, because this is just extra information. It's just her name. It doesn't define which sister. It's just extra information. My sister, Susie, is a paramedic. But if you have more than one sister, you're saying my sister, the one who is called Susie, is a paramedic, and so then you don't use any commas. This is a defining relative clause, and you mustn't use commas in defining relative clauses. It means this information is essential. It defines that first sister. Okay, so in non-defining relative clauses you need commas around the piece of extra information, and I repeat this point in number 5 because it's not just relative clauses which have extra information. This sentence, his most popular novel, comma, War and Peace, comma, is still a bestseller. Now you can see that this information is non-essential. You can check, because you can take that information out and it still reads fine. His most popular novel is still a bestseller. It reads very well, it's logical. But sometimes when you take out this middle part, it becomes illogical and nonsensical, and that means that you've got a defining relative clause like down here, and you mustn't use commas for a defining relative clause because this part is too closely connected to this part. Okay, in conditionals, first, second, third, mixed, any conditional, if at the start, use a comma. If in the middle, don't use a comma. Nice, simple instructions for conditionals. If I were rich, comma, I would buy a car. I would buy a car if I were rich. And I even think when we say these two conditionals, we generally pause here. If I were rich, I would buy a car. But we don't usually pause here. I would buy a car if I were rich. Yeah, we normally just run it off the tongue, and so very often we say use a comma when you make a pause. It's true, we often do. So introductory phrases or afterthoughts or contrast between two clauses, a little bit like here, then we need a comma. So yes, it's true, comma after yes. Nevertheless, comma, we disagree. This is my money, comma, not yours. This is a contrast here. It's like, I can climb this tree, comma, but you can't. Yeah, but you can't. It's a contrast, and you're still connecting up to subordinate clauses. But introductory phrases like please, yes, nevertheless, therefore, meanwhile, moreover, furthermore, firstly, secondly, thirdly, all of these expressions which you very often use in an essay when you're writing, you should put a comma after them. So please remember this for the writing part of an exam. It will punctuate your essay to a much higher level if you remember this. Okay, number 8, when you address someone before their name, put a comma. I'm sorry to hear that, Ben. You must put a comma before the name. And Richard, please listen to me. You must put a comma after the name here. Okay, so when you're addressing someone directly, I should say that, directly. When you directly address someone, you must use a comma. In direct speech, we also need a comma. I don't know, comma, he said, comma, if I like you. So use the commas to separate the direct speech from the he said or I asked or he told me. Make sure you use a comma to separate up those parts of speech. Now number 10 is a difficult one, and it involves because. Usually with because we don't use a comma, because the because part is explaining directly the previous clause and it's very closely connected to it. However, in an example like number 10, we didn't. Now I want you to notice it's a negative example. It's when you have a negative clause first that this gets more complicated. We didn't win the match, comma, because I wasn't playing. Now here I'm saying something a little bit arrogant, a little bit boastful. I'm saying that our team didn't win the football match, and the reason they didn't win the football match was because I wasn't playing. However, if I take away this comma, we didn't win the match because I wasn't playing, then this because becomes very, very close to the not in this sentence, and it suddenly becomes unclear. You might say something like this: we didn't win the match because I wasn't playing, we lost the match because it was raining. We lost the match because the other team were much better than us. So as soon as you take out the comma, suddenly this part, because I wasn't playing, it's suddenly not necessarily the reason why we didn't win the match. It's perhaps not the reason, and actually you're saying we didn't win the match because I wasn't playing. No, we lost the match because the weather spoilt our chances, or the referee was biased, or whatever. So I hope I've made that clear. It's a little bit strange with because, and when you've got a negative sentence, you very often, the meaning which you wish to convey, and it depends, but very often if you want to say it was because I wasn't playing, then yeah, you need a comma here if you're being arrogant and saying we didn't win the match because I wasn't playing. Okay, lastly, number 11 down here, dates and places. Better make a bit of space for this. We also use a comma if we say I met him on June the 2nd, 1989. Yeah, something like that. June the 2nd, comma, 1989. Okay, you must use these commas when you give a date like that before the year. And if the sentence continues, something like this, maybe we put this at the end of the sentence, on June the 2nd, 1989, comma, I met him. Okay? So remember to put your commas in the dates and also places. If you're saying he lives in Dallas, Texas, you need a comma after Dallas. In Dallas, Texas, because Dallas is a city in Texas, I think. But he lives in London, the UK, would be the same, because it's to separate the two locations. Okay, there are probably other points to say about the comma, and please write them under the video if you think I've missed something. It's always interesting to discuss some other things which I could have mentioned, but I think that these are the most important parts. If there's something you're not certain of, please ask questions under the video. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope to see you all soon.